Hello class, and welcome to another lecture by Professor Choi. Today we're going to be talking about externalities, environmental policy, and what exactly are public goods. Now, an externality is basically a benefit or a cost that affects someone who is not directly involved in the production or the consumption of a good or service, aka a third party. Externalities could be positive or they could be negative. An example of a negative externality is something like pollution. An example of a positive externality is something like education. Now let's try to visualize why something is an externality. Education, for example. As an individual, one of the reasons why you decide to get educated is because it's supposed to be the college over here, by the way. So one of the reasons you decide to get a degree is because you think eventually you're going to be making more money, because having knowledge is power. In other words, there are all these positive benefits to being educated. Now, those are basically private benefits that you receive. And of course, because it is a market transaction, you pay the college, so the college benefits by receiving money, and you benefit also by receiving all these things that get transferred to you. All right? None of those are externalities. An externality is something that happens to a third party, somebody who is not involved in the particular transaction. So I want you to think about a transaction as being a sort of a supply and demand transaction. And then this is a price, this is a quantity. And then this price reflects the benefit and the cost to the individual and the college in this case, but it does not reflect the third party. Now, who exactly is this third party? Well, let's say you have children. Now, your education, if it in fact gives you all these positive benefits, is not just going to benefit you, but it's also going to benefit your children. Your children were not involved in the original transaction of going to college. Therefore, they receive a positive externality. Another example of a positive externality is something like immunizations. If you decide to get vaccinated and protect yourself against something, then basically whoever sold you the vaccine makes money because you bought it, and then you receive the benefit, and I'm using dollars by the way, but the benefit could be something else, okay? You receive the benefit of that vaccine by having some kind of immunity or protection against whatever you got vaccinated. But it is also a positive externality because when you are vaccinated, not only are you protecting yourself, but you're protecting other people by creating immunity for them. In other words, if you have a virus that is being transmitted from a person to person, because you are protected due to that vaccine, then it is very difficult for the virus to be transmitted through you. Therefore, you are protecting all the people, and that's what a positive externality is. A negative externality is the opposite of that. It is when two people engage in a transaction and then that third individual gets harmed by that transaction. An example of a negative externality is secondhand smoking. Now, when you smoke, you receive the benefit of smoking, and the company that sold you the cigarette receives the benefit of the fact that you pay them. Again, this is a private transaction. But because you smoke, there are negative side effects of that. Negative side effects include basically very similar side effects as if this person was smoking. So this individual is receiving negative benefits from a transaction that they did not incur in, and that's what we call a negative externality. So a positive externality is an extra benefit that society receives from a particular transaction, while a negative externality is an extra cost that society receives from a particular transaction. So it's kind of like the difference between the private cost and a social cost. Now here's a way to visualize positive externalities using the supply and demand model. So in this case, let's try to visualize a positive externality. And again, remember, an example of a positive externality is something like education. So here we have our supply line, here we have our demand line. I want you to think about this supply and demand as being our private supply and demand. So let's put a PR on it as private. So when you look at this equilibrium price that you see here on supply and demand, that equilibrium price reflects a particular price, aka benefit to the producer, but also a particular benefit to the consumer. So this is our private benefit or cost. And this is our private benefit or quantity. Now, because this is education provides a positive externality, then we can show a positive externality by basically saying that the real benefit to society is up here. So this is the real social benefit of education, which is higher than the benefit received by the private transaction. All right, now let's talk about a negative externality. So a negative externality is an extra cost to society. So here we have our supply, our demand, and again, this reflects our private benefit, private demand. Forgot to label my axis here. There we go. So when we look at supply and demand, and we look at this price equilibrium, that equilibrium price reflects the private benefit and cost of that particular transaction. And again, to be more specific, we said that smoking is a negative externality transaction. All right, so a negative externality is an extra cost imposed on society, imposed on a third party, aka someone outside of the original transaction. Now, the way we like to show that, it's the same as a sort of tax on society. So this is a real cost to society of smoking. It's not only the cost of the individual, but it is also the cost of all people who get secondhand smoking. So in a negative externality, this reflects the social cost and in a positive externality, this reflects the social benefit or the extra social benefit. Okay? So that's another way of visualizing positive and negative externalities. Now, another reason why we have externalities is because the market has something we call market failure. A market failure is a situation in which the market fails to produce the efficient level of output, or it fails to produce a particular good at all. And there are plenty of cases where there is market failure. In order to understand a little bit about market failure, I just want you to think about goods where the market will simply not provide it, even though these are necessary goods for society, simply because the market, in order to exist, requires particular things to be there. Out of the top of my head, I'm thinking the market always requires a payment. The market, therefore, always requires some kind of profit. So unless there is a profit motive, particular goods will not be provided. An example of a market failure is national defense. Private defense will exist because if you have the money, somebody will be willing to protect you. So you can get private bodyguards, you can get a private army, etc. But a public army, aka the US military, which protects everyone in the entire country, whether or not you pay taxes or whether or not you work or whether or not you're a US citizen, etc., will not exist. Because the market requires a profit motive to exist, and therefore a public military only exists if the government creates it. Otherwise, it would only be a private military. Very similar with the problem of education. Private education will exist. It doesn't, and that again does not require government to exist. But public education for everyone in society, it's more difficult because there are particular people who cannot afford education. So if we don't figure out a way to provide it as a public good, then it will not exist. And that is what we call a market failure. So a market failure is a situation in which the market fails to produce the efficient level of output of a particular good, or it fails to produce the good at all. Why do we have externalities? Well, there are multiple reasons. The first one is because everyone is not familiar with what their property rights are. Another problem is sometimes we have what we call incomplete property rights, where the property rights are not clearly defined, and therefore people do whatever they think is better for them. And of course, that has to do with whatever they want to do versus whatever other people want them to do. So we have what we call incomplete property rights. Pollution is a really good example of how we have incomplete property rights because pretty much everyone pollutes, some people more and some people less, but it is not clear who is supposed to be fixing the problem. So all of society bears the cost of extra pollution, but it is not clear who is in charge of paying for that cost or fixing the problem. Another example of incomplete property rights is one that I like to use all the time. So imagine that this is the wall between you and your neighbor. And you're over here in your bed trying to go to sleep. Because you're tired and you gotta wake up tomorrow morning to go to work. But your neighbor has decided that they're going to have a party. And of course, the party is pretty loud. Now, what happens when your neighbor has a pretty loud party? Well, you can hear all the noise. That's what we call noise pollution. All right, now, here's the problem. The problem is that, of course, your neighbor has the right to have a party, but you also have the right to go to sleep. So, when do his rights end and yours begin? Or when do yours begin and theirs end? Your neighbor is going to do uninhibited whatever he wants to do, and you're going to do uninhibited whatever you want to do. So if it was up to you trying to go to sleep, you will stop your neighbor's party, but if it was up to your neighbor, he will stop you from sleeping. Okay? And again, this is what we call a market failure. All right, now, why do we need, why is it that we need here intervention by the government? Well, the government could introduce a noise pollution law or an ordinance, depending on at what level do you do it. And then that creates a sort of boundary for property rights. So your government in the area can basically say, well, you could have a party up to 11 p.m. and then after 11 p.m. your party has to be quiet. In other words, this is the time where his rights end and yours begin. All right, so solutions to externalities can be private or can be public. A private solution is basically when you try to solve the problem with your neighbor. So I want you to think about a private, this is a market transaction, by the way. I know it doesn't sound like somebody selling anything to somebody else, but I want you to think about this being a market transaction. So you want to sleep, your neighbor's having a party. There are private ways for you to fix this problem. You can contact your neighbor and be like, look, I'll pay you to be quiet. If your neighbor says, okay, cool, that's enough money for me to be quiet, and he goes quiet, then problem solved privately. All right? Another solution is for you to go to your neighbor, forget paying your neighbor, by the way, try something cheaper, before paying. So imagine just showing up to your neighbor, knocking on his door, and telling him, hey, friend, I need to go to work tomorrow. It would be nice if you guys would be quiet. And your neighbor basically maybe goes, okay, cool, dude, don't worry about it. We'll lower the volume. So they take that speaker, they lower the volume, you go back to sleep, and they can have the party. Again, this is another private solution. Okay? So a private solution can exist to pretty much every problem. But then what we're trying to explain is that there are plenty of times where private solutions don't work. So there is no particular way in which a problem can be solved privately, and therefore the government has to step in and provide that particular product or that particular service or that particular solution. Now, one of the ways in which we can kind of figure out how to approach this is by thinking about a marginal benefit, marginal cost of these transactions. Some problems are more desirable if you allow them to solve themselves, because otherwise it will be too expensive. An example of something like this, by the way, is a car crash. So let's say these two cars got into a crash. So this car was driving in this direction, this one stopped all of a sudden for whatever reason, and boom. the one behind hits the car. All right, so I want you to think about kind of like few ways to go about this. So way number one, imagine that we don't have any car insurance. So no one has any insurance and there is no police. The way we will fix this problem is between the two of you, you have to figure out who's at fault and who's going to pay the other person. Now, the way this should work is whoever's behind and hits somebody else should say, okay, it's my fault and I'll pay you for the damages that I've created. The fact of the matter is, people don't do that. All right, now I want you to think about option number two with private insurance, but no police. If we have private insurance, then a person can pay another person through insurance. Problem solved. But it is difficult because the individual will not accept that they are the one at fault. Because remember, if you say that you're the one at fault, there's a high likelihood that insurance will go up in price. Because of course, you caused the crash, and therefore you're more likely to have a crash in the future. So this one will probably not function very well either. Both of these are going to cause other externalities to society. In this one here, I'm thinking, I don't know, there might be a lot of fights on the streets. Okay? On this one right here, I'm thinking there might be a lot of people going to court to figure out who is at fault and who's not at fault. And I want you to think about you being your own lawyer or how much money the lawyer's going to cost you. Now I want you to think about option three, which is kind of like what we have in most of the United States today. So today you are required to have car insurance. So both individuals are supposed to have car insurance. The government has created a system where a police officer comes in and they decide who's at fault. So they make you at fault by giving you a ticket. Okay? Now once you are at fault, then you are the one who's going to pay the other person for their damages. Problem solved. Okay? Now of course, there's also a sort of backup, in case you don't agree with this whole transaction, you can go ahead and go to court, and then a judge will decide then who is at fault and who's not at fault and who owes who money. But most people with this transaction are functioning. All right? And again, this is kind of like the whole idea of positive and negative externalities. So in many ways, sometimes it is more desirable to allow the market to self-correct, but in some events, it is not desirable to allow the market to self-correct, and therefore the government has to step in and provide its own solutions. One of the things that you need to keep always in mind is that when you involve the government, there are very high transaction costs. Depending on transaction costs, sometimes it is more desirable for the market to self-correct because it might be too expensive for the system to handle it. Economist Ronald Coase proposed what we call today the Coase Theorem. Basically what he said is that if transaction costs are low, then private bargaining normally results in an efficient solution to the problem of externalities. He also added that somebody has to define property rights clearly. And of course the number of parties should be small because once you get to a certain size, it's very difficult for all the parties to compromise into one solution. Now, what it's really used today in a lot of places, when the government is the one offering a particular solution, is what we call Pigouvian Solutions. So In a basic way, when you see a negative externality, the government comes in and they tax the production of the negative externality or figure out how to legislate against that negative externality, therefore shifting the supply to the left and increasing the burden on the private individual. In a positive externality, the government increases the demand for the product, therefore creating an incentive for people to basically participate on the products that create a positive externality. The economist that came up with these ideas, his name was A.C. Pigou, and that's what we call it today, Pigouvian taxes or subsidies. So in a very basic way, to solve the problem of externalities, either we tax it if we want to reduce the quantity of production, or we subsidize it if we want to increase the quantity of production of that product. Another solution to externalities is what we call the command and control approach. In the command and control approach, the government basically comes in and takes over the production or the quantitative limits on that production of that particular product. So a really good example of things like this are pollution devices that are installed in cars, plus all the different little regulations that we have on vehicles today. Now, in the case of climate change, there are different solutions that are being proposed out there, a lot of which may or may not work. Let me sort of explain a few, and these three are three different ways that have been proposed to fix the problem of global warming or climate change. The first solution is what we call a cap and trade system. In a cap and trade system, the government will come in and they will create a cap on the amount of pollution. So an example of this is, imagine that these are three different companies. So these are the companies in the system. So company 1, company 2, and company 3. And the height of this bar is the amount of pollution that that company is producing. So the way a cap and trade system will work is the government will come in and it will cap the level of pollution. So I don't know, imagine that this is equal to 3, whatever 3 means. Okay? So we cap the level of pollution at 3. All right, now imagine that next year, company 3 is growing very rapidly and they need more pollution in order to be able to do that production. Then what the next thing that would happen is the government will create a market to trade pollution rights. So when you think about a supply and demand of pollution rights. Now in this market, the supply of pollution will basically be fixed. So in other words, the supply of pollution will be whatever the government provides as the cap that we want pollution to be, and then people would have to trade the pollution rights. So the way this company will be able to basically produce more pollution is if this company was to reduce their pollution level and pass the pollution rights to this company here. Now, why would this company want to reduce their pollution level? Well, because there is a market for pollution rights, and reducing pollution levels actually makes them money. So what we will be doing is we would be basically monetizing the reduction of pollution, and by the same token monetizing the increase in pollution, and therefore creating a carbon price. Okay? All right, another solution is direct imposition of taxes. In a very simple way, think of it as the government comes in and says, well, this is how much pollution you're allowed, and that's it. And then if you go beyond, then the government basically creates a tax for that. So every time you increase your pollution amount, then it's going to cost you more and more money. Therefore, you have the incentive to kind of not go beyond a certain amount of pollution every year because it's going to keep costing you more and more money. All right, that is solution number 2. The third solution is something that has been proposed as a sort of country size or maybe global size. And this is basically the sequestration of CO2. So I want you to think, what a lot of people are basically thinking about is imagine that we just plant like a lot of trees, so trees are supposed to take carbon and then give us oxygen. Carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, and then give us oxygen. But another way we could do it is we could basically take all of that carbon in some artificial way. So I don't know, out of the top of my head, I'm thinking, imagine ships all over the ocean that have these machines on it where when air goes by, it sequesters the carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, and it kind of puts it there in a sort of a container, pressurized container, and then it exhales the air. All right, so basically a sort of a bunch of ships in the ocean that are constantly cleaning the air. Now, what do we do with these containers? Well, we have plenty of options. Some people are basically saying, well, we could launch it into space, for example. That will get rid of us here. Get rid of it here. Another option is to take it back to the bottom of the ocean. If you put it at a high enough pressure, a lot of this stuff becomes a liquid. So basically, if you're able to kind of like dump it literally at the bottom of the ocean, it will just stay in the bottom of the ocean in liquid form because of all the pressure that the ocean is exerting in it. All right. So anyway, there are all these different things that have been proposed, but that's option number 3. So if the problem is carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, then we could basically take that carbon monoxide and dioxide and then contain it and send it somewhere. All right, now what is the actual solution that we're going to have? Who knows? And welcome to why we're having a conversation about externalities. All right. Now let's talk about the difference between a private good, a public good, a quasi-public good, and a common resource. A private good is a good that is both rival and excludable, and most private goods have to be rival and excludable in order to exist. Now, what exactly is rival and excludable? Well, rivalry is a situation that occurs when one person consuming a unit of a good means that no one else can consume it, and excludability is a situation in which anyone who doesn't pay for the good cannot consume it, so we don't have a free rider problem. So a rival good is basically a good that you can contain. I want you to think about having some kind of unit or metric to measure it, so when you transfer it to another person, you can count it. Private goods need to be rival because companies need to be able to count how many units they sold to you so they can charge you. I want you to think about gigabytes of data for your internet service. I want you to think about minutes on your cell phone service. I want you to think about gallons of gasoline, ounces of soda, numbers of phones. So the goods that can be sold in the market have to be rival. Excludability basically means that the situation has to exist where if you don't pay for it, you cannot get it. Again, if there are too many people that are getting something for free, then the market at some point will decide not to produce that free product because it doesn't give them any benefit. All right, so again, a private good has to be both rival and excludable. Most public goods are are non-rival and non-excludable. In other words, usually when you have a public good, you only have the one public good, not that many options, and you cannot exclude non-payers. An example again is national defense. So national defense is provided for everyone who is in the US at the time where national defense is necessary. And that doesn't mean that you pay or don't pay taxes, or whether you're elderly or young, or even if you're a pet, you'll be protected, aka the national defense system is supposed to protect the entire US territory. A quasi-public good is a good that is excludable but not rival. Examples of stuff like this are government-created expressways like the Florida Turnpike, things like cable TV, Florida Power and Light, or companies that provide mortgages or mortgage insurance so that people can buy mortgages, and so that you can afford to have a 3% down payment for a house. A quasi-public good is usually a good that was created either privately and then became quasi-public, or it was created to be quasi-public, aka partially public, partially private. A common resource is a resource that is rival but not excludable. And an example of this is fish in the ocean or forest land without an owner. Most common resources don't really exist in anymore. There are very few places where you have common resources. I mean, out of the top of my head, think about like the middle of the ocean when it's no one's land or no one has a claim on it, then that is a common resource. But otherwise, everything today is someone's land, and if it's no one's land, then it's the government's land. All right. One of the things that you want to start thinking about when it comes to this is how is it that a good goes, or a good or service goes from being public to being private, or from being private to being public. And this is where a healthcare debate is a healthy debate still in the US. So there are plenty of politicians out there proposing what we call a single payer system. And other people are calling it Medicare for all. So in a very basic way, the government will provide a sort of government insurance, aka Medicare, or something of that sort, and they will be your insurance company. What we had in the year 2010 with the Affordable Health Care Act was more of a deal when insurance companies would provide insurance to all Americans through healthcare.gov, and it ended up being something much different than that. So the reason you want to engage, by the way, in this debate is because healthcare in the US is extremely expensive, and the way we're doing healthcare today is probably not the most efficient way. And COVID-19 in the year 2020 has exposed a lot of these problems on the healthcare system in the US. All right, so here's one of the major reasons why a healthcare debate should continue and a solution should be found. The list of countries that you see here are basically countries that provide healthcare for pretty much everyone in their population. And the number that you see there is the cost per citizen to provide that healthcare for everyone. Okay? So again, these are countries that provide healthcare for pretty much everyone in their population, and that is the cost per person to provide that healthcare. This is the cost per person in the US. Notice that the cost per person in the US is at least 40% higher than the closest country on the list. And by the way, the US is the most expensive place in the world to get healthcare. And it is almost 60% more expensive than the average of all these countries that you see on this list, which is the Organization of Economic and Development, also known as basically the richest countries in the world, the list of richest countries in the world per capita. All right, so the main reason we need to keep having a healthcare debate is because in the US, we don't cover a large portion of our population, and we pay the most expensive healthcare in the world. Now, at the end of the day, how exactly does a good goes from private to public again? Well, it really depends on the public and how people believe something should or should not be done. And I want you to kind of quickly go through this experiment with me, and let's talk about the fire of London. All right. Now, the Great Fire of London happened somewhere around September 2nd to September 6th of 1666. All right. Now, the Great Fire of London exposed the necessity for firefighters. So I want you to think about the way, again, something goes from being private to being public. There was a time where cities were getting very big. There was a time where they were not. So in other words, there was a time where this was your house, this is your neighbor's house, and there's plenty of space between you. And then over here is the castle, where the king and the queen live. You know, and their structure is pretty solid and made out of rock. So they don't have to worry about it. Plus it's all the way up there on the top of the mountain. But as cities got bigger and bigger, one of the things that happened is people started building next to other people. And next to the castle. The Great Fire of London was one of those cases. So what basically happened was the fire started somewhere at the end of the city, and then there was no firefighters to fight the fire. At the time, all of this was private. So basically, if your house is on fire, what you got to do is you got to call all your neighbors to help you out put that fire. But of course, what's the problem? When the next house to you is very far away, this is not a social issue at all. It's your individual problem. But when all the houses are next to each other, we have an externality, because you can now spread the fire to the house next to it, and 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 the house next to it. And the next thing you know, you have days of uncontrolled fire in London, and next thing you know, the king and the queen are looking down at the fire going, oh Lord, this is not good. And welcome to the creation of firefighters. All right. So again, this is how, in general, we create, or we go from something that's private to something that's quasi-public to something that's public. So this is how goods get sort of transformed and move around. So if the private healthcare system is working for everybody and most people don't care and things are okay, then people will not ask for a public one. But if that doesn't work, then we move around. All right. So anyway, it's really all about supply and demand and the marginal benefit, marginal cost to society. One of the things that does seem to be very clear, by the way, about externalities is that common goods don't work very well. We call it the tragedy of commons. The tragedy of commons is a tendency of common resources to be overused. Like if you're a fisherman and you have unlimited access to the ocean, one of the problems that we have is that you may decide to overfish. And as you overfish, we need to restrict you because otherwise we run out of fish. In places where we have noticed that we don't put restrictions on common resources, one of the major things that happens is that people basically go and take all the resources and don't worry about the negative side effects of not having it in the future. This is how entire forests have been cut down. This is how islands don't have any trees anymore. This is how fish have become extinct or are in the process of extinction. Okay? This is a pushback to a lot of this stuff, by the way, are all these conservation efforts all over the world to try to preserve animal species that are in the process of extinction, or to try to preserve things that we think should be there for posterity but are currently being overfished or overbought or over consumed. All right, so hopefully you had a pretty good understanding today in my chapter about externalities, policy for environment, and public goods and how do they work. Thank you for hanging out with Professor Choi again, and have a good one.